I have hooded oily lids and I tried 16 eyeshadow primers, and I'm going to be showing you the 12-hour wear test that I did with each of these, and I definitely have some thoughts and I have some notes, and I'm going to do my best to rank these, but I feel like there's a couple of different ways I could rank these. I could either rank these just by how they wore, but I could also rank them on how the eyeshadow blended on top of them, and then I could also rank them based on both of the two things together, which is what I'm going to be doing at the end of the video. But first, let's get into some of the parameters for the wear test. So for the mattes, I used the Viseart mattes. I have a bunch of these palettes, pretty much almost all of them at this point, and I love this formula. This is one of my favorite formulas of all time, so I wanted to make sure I use a formula that I really do love and enjoy, and I have a lot of experience with. And for the shimmers, I also really wanted to keep it consistent and use only one specific formula, but I wanted a little bit of variety because I can't wear the same look 16 times over. I need some variety, so I'm using the Deep Iridescent shimmers from the Stained Glass collection from Clionadh Cosmetics, and I just basically used all the different shades. And I was also predominantly using 2 shades on the lid, and then maybe just blending out the edges with a lighter shade. There are, of course, a couple of variables, which are, even though I was wearing them to the office and I was wearing them for about 12 hours, there are some variables in terms of what was the weather like that day. Was it an extra cold day? Was it a little bit more of a warmer day? It is starting to warm up a little bit here. And then something else out of my control really is my hormones, and how my hormones might affect the level of oiliness on my lid that day, or maybe my lids were actually a little bit drier on said day. So there are quite a few variables. The other thing is how much matte shadow exactly did I apply, how long I waited for it to set down, and also how much of the shimmer did I put down. I did use just water to mist it to help put down the shadows. And also for all the looks, I use the same brushes. So I use the Rephr 14 brush, I use the Rephr 13 mini, and then for the shimmer application I use the What's Up Beauty R110. So again, there's a couple of things that are kind of, you know, a set standard going across, but there are still quite a few variables. So I'm also going to be talking about pricing and how much of the product you're actually getting, and I'm going to be showing you footage of application as well as how the eyeshadow looked at the end of the day. Because something I've noticed with trying different eyeshadow primers over the course of, I don't know, over probably 15 years of different eyeshadow primers I've been using way prior to this video, I have noticed some matte formulas work differently on certain eyeshadow primers and kind of vice versa. Some of them just like tend to stick down a little bit and some of them blend out just fine, and I feel like that is something definitely I wanted to speak to because it is very important if you're buying an eyeshadow primer. You not only want to have great wear time, but you want to have some ease of blending as well. First up is the e.l.f. and Milani primers. So the Milani primer, you get 0.3 ounces and it is $9.99, and you can of course get it cheaper depending on where you're buying it from. And then the e.l.f. primer, you're getting 0.23 ounces and it is $7. So with the Milani primer, I did notice just a little bit of sticking down and needing to blend it out a little bit harder, versus on the e.l.f. primer I just had a little bit easier time of it blending and of it not really catching on. And again, that could be partially because of the matte formula and the primer, so maybe a different matte formula would work a little bit better on both of these primers. Overall, neither of them really caused me like a lot of trouble to the point where I would really notice it and was thinking that it was taking a little bit too long to create the eye look, which is a pretty simple eye look, as I just threw a matte in the outer crease, blended it into the inner crease, and then put a deepening up shade in the outer corner. And surprisingly enough, the Milani primer did crease on me just a little, just a hair bit more, but really just by a tiny bit. It was almost unnoticeable. It wasn't extreme creasing where someone would be looking at me and would be thinking, oh my gosh, somebody please help this girl out with her eyeshadow. So overall, I would say both of these were pretty good. I wasn't really expecting absolutely no creasing or anything like that with most of these. I kind of figured there would be just a little bit of creasing here and there. It's just a matter of how much and can I fix it, which of course for all of these I did not go ahead and fix it throughout the day. I just let it stay and get worse and worse, or sometimes the creasing and fading just kind of stops at a certain point and then just doesn't get any worse. The next two wear tests were Pat McGrath and MAC Cosmetics. So the Pat McGrath intensifies long wear primer, and as well as the MAC Prep and Prime 24-hour extended eye base. So the MAC primer is $32 and it is 0.4 ounces, and this one is basically almost exactly the same thing as the Smashbox one, which I used to have the Smashbox one, and after I got this one I was like, it's the same thing, and mine was a little bit old, so I didn't end up repurchasing it. And this one is pretty much kind of like if you were to put down a more silicone-y type of mostly transparent type of primer on your face. I feel like this is almost like that. It's definitely a little bit thicker and it has that soft pillowy feeling of silicone. The Pat McGrath primer is $32 and you get 0.16 ounces, and this one is definitely a little bit thinner but not quite like super liquidy, and also has a little bit of that silicone feel to it but not quite as much as the MAC. So with the Pat McGrath primer, I did notice I had easier time blending than, for example, the Milani, and then with the MAC primer I had a little bit harder time blending out, so the mattes did stick down just a little bit, similarly to the Milani primer. I generally find that to be the case when it comes to these types of silicone primers. I do prefer if I can get a primer that has a little bit of coverage. One has no coverage at all. They're pretty undetectable once you put it on the lid. So while these silicone like primers tend to have better wear, I just find the blending to not be really ideal. As for the end of the day, the Pat McGrath definitely creased way more, the most so far. While the MAC one had a lot less creasing, almost no creasing, it was a very subtle, which again is one of those things that it's like, do I want to have to work for my blend a little bit while I have a little bit better wear time? But I have definitely worn the Pat McGrath primer previously quite a few times, and I don't remember having this much creasing, so I don't know if it was just kind of an outlier, but I have had great wear time with this primer previously, so it kind of seems to be kind of like a hit or miss with this one, so maybe it's a little bit unpredictable. Next two primers are the Devinah Prelusion Eye Base and then the Urban Decay Eyeshadow Primer Potion. This is the original, not the, there's like one that's supposed to be anti-wrinkle or something like that, and this one does have a little bit of coverage, just the tiniest bit, just barely. The Devinah has no coverage. It's a little bit more similar to the MAC in texture. The Urban Decay primer, you're getting 0.33 ounces and it's $28, while Devinah is $10 and you get 0.88 fluid ounces, so you definitely get a lot more product. Something else with all the eyeshadow primers, they do have different shelf lives. When the Devinah primer first came out, I did do a video and I did kind of talk about my thoughts on it, and I definitely was experiencing some issues with blending different formulas on top of it. I just feel like either they were kind of blending away, or they were not wanting to build up, or they were kind of sticking down a little bit. Something else I've noticed with this primer is I feel like the moment I put it on, my eyelids almost look like the life has been sucked out of them, and they look just a little bit more, they look more wrinkly, and it is something I immediately noticed, especially this time when I was doing the wear test and I put it on. It was like immediate, and then putting the matte shadow on top of it, I feel like accentuated that even more. So I wasn't really a huge fan overall between the blending and the way it made my lid look. On the other hand, with the Urban Decay primer, I would compare this one to maybe, in terms of texture, a little bit more similar to the Pat McGrath. I've used this one quite a few times with different formulas. This one very sometimes does have the eyeshadow stick down just a little bit, but when I used it with this look, I didn't notice anything out of the ordinary. I had a great time blending and applying. It was quick and easy. As for the wear test, the Devinah primer performed amazingly. I had no creasing, zero creasing, no fading. I did notice that the shimmer almost kind of traveled up as almost like in one piece, so it wasn't really feathered on the edge, which I thought was really interesting because it's kind of like it was really sticking on for dear life, but it just like kind of shifted up a little bit, which is not a big deal at all. I just thought it was interesting the way that it did move and migrate above my crease. While with the Urban Decay primer, I did experience a little bit of creasing, but again, nothing too much, definitely nowhere near the Pat McGrath level. This is the Ulta Matte Veil Long Wear Eye Primer, and this one, I think they repackaged it. I don't know if they reformulated it, but I was excited to try this one out because it is quite affordable and it does have a little bit of coverage. And then the Too Faced Shadow Insurance Primer, you have heard me probably talking about this for quite some time. I love this primer so much. It's also a little bit more thicker than the Ulta Matte Veil. The Ulta primer is $13 and you're getting 0.3 ounces. The Too Faced primer is $28 and you're getting 0.20 fluid ounces. Something else I would like to note on this one is I did take the stopper out because I just couldn't, after a certain point, you can't really grab any of the product that's all the way in the bottom, and because it is a thicker, kind of almost a moussey formula, it's just harder to pick up when you have the stopper in. So I did remove the stopper and there's quite a bit of product definitely to get through. I would just make sure that you're really tightening and closing it. And I also want to mention that this one has a little bit of a scent to it. It's kind of like a coconutty type of scent. It's noticeable for only the moment you're kind of like bringing it up to your lid. Definitely one of the more expensive eyeshadow primers that I'm talking about in this video. From general experience with both of the primers, I do sometimes experience the sticking down of the eyeshadow just a little bit, especially if I don't wait enough for it to set. I do think that's one of the key things, is making sure that you're giving enough time for this to set down a little bit, to just kind of settle in, because if you go in with a matte shadow and you literally just put on the primer, you might be more likely to experience the sticking down. Blending experience is about the same between the Too Faced and the Ulta primer. I would say kind of similar to the Milani, PMG, and e.l.f., but I already know that I really like both of these. The way I use the Too Faced Shadow Insurance Primer, I do set it to have the best wear time, and we will be talking about that later. So how did these wear? The Ulta primer had a little bit of creasing on the inner lid, and so did the Too Faced. I would say that they were about the same amount of creasing. The next two primers are not really well known, and these are from Moira. I was really curious because this one, the purple one, says waterproof peptide eyeshadow primer. I'm assuming it's supposed to be kind of like the dupe for the version of this from Urban Decay, and then the other one is just an eyeshadow primer. So I was expecting this one to perform so great, and also this one is $1 more than this one. I'm not really sure why. So this regular primer is $8, and you're getting 0.270 ounces, same amount of ounces in the waterproof, but it is $9. I didn't experience having a little bit of a harder time blending the mattes and layering them or anything like that. Like, had a really easy time applying the eyeshadow, especially compared to some of these other ones that I did have to just work a little bit harder blending, and they do not have any coverage either. So as for the wear times though, the wear times is where it really got me. The waterproof one creased way more than the non-waterproof one, and also it creased more than a lot of these other primers. So I don't know if the reasons for it creasing was the fact that this has peptides in it, but it's definitely not a primer that I'm going to be reaching for anytime soon, especially because I don't want to experience that kind of creasing. The regular primer did crease on me, but just a little bit, kind of similarly to the Ulta, the Too Faced, the Milani, and the e.l.f. Those kind of were all similarly on par with each other. The next two primers are the Wet n Wild Mega Last, and then the Melt Cosmetics, what is this, liquid eyeshadow and base. So this is technically a liquid eyeshadow, but they're also calling it a base, so I thought I would include it in here as a wear time, because they do talk about these on their website as being an eyeshadow base as well, and claiming that it will extend the wear of your eyeshadow. So they do have a couple of different other shades, and I have the shade Vanilla. It's definitely not the right shade for my skin tone, and you'll see that on application. It's got a little bit of pearliness to it, and it's also like slightly leaning orange. The undertone of this will alter the way that the eyeshadows look. So the matte base is $24, and you get 0.10 fluid ounces, and then the Wet n Wild is $5.49, and you get 0.34 fluid ounces, but you can get it at Walgreens for $4.99. So I wasn't a huge fan of this application, because since I used two different eyeshadow primers, it made my eyeshadow look different, because the way the eyeshadow looked on something that has a little bit of an undertone versus the Wet n Wild, which has no base to it. So I'm not really sure how much use I'll get out of this one, because I do think it's just a little bit too off from my skin tone to kind of get away with using this one. Also not really sure how I feel about the fact that it has a little bit of a sheen to it. It's very subtle, but it's still kind of there, and I'm not really sure that I feel like I need to have a sheen like all over the lid. That being said, I had a great time blending on top of it. I think that the mattes applied really beautifully and layered on just fine. It was a quick eyeshadow look for sure. As for the Wet n Wild, I also didn't experience the mattes catching at all. I had a great time blending. I do think that the blending was maybe slightly a little bit better on the melt, but overall had no issues. As for the wear test, I did have just the tiniest amount of creasing, just like with a lot of these other eyeshadow primers, so nothing too crazy, nothing too noticeable. I thought it was interesting that where it creased on the melt primer was slightly different than on the Wet n Wild primer. So on the Wet n Wild primer, it creased on the inner part of my lid. On the Wet n Wild primer, it creased more in the actual crease, and I feel like that has a lot to do with my eye shape, because it is something that I've already noticed that both of my lids are just slightly different, so eyeshadows do tend to wear just slightly differently, and they kind of crease in slightly different areas, but it really just depends on the day. The next two primers are both drugstore primers. So the NYX is the Shadow and Liner Primer, while the About Face is called Smoothing Shadow Fix, and I would say the texture of these is a little bit similar. The next primer is $11, and you get 0.27 ounces, while the About Face is $13, and you get 0.405 fluid ounces. They actually have the ounces wrong on the website, so I did write down what it said on the tube versus what's on the Ulta website, because it said something like 0.05 in. I was like, there's no way there's such a little amount of product in here. I did experience a little bit of sticking down with the NYX primer, just a little bit harder to blend, especially compared to the About Face. I had a much easier time blending on this one. Both of these wore so nicely. I had really no visible creasing, so I would say these would kind of go right after the Devinah primer in terms of wear time. Definitely some of the best wear time out of all 16 of the primers. So I was very impressed because I don't really reach for the About Face all that much. I feel like the times I've used it, I have had some like hits and misses with blending on top of it. We're on to the last two primers. I have the Sigma eyeshadow primer and the Natasha Denona. I have repurchased this multiple times and I do really like the way that most eyeshadows blend on it. However, it usually doesn't have, spoiler alert, the best wear time, and it's probably because it is the closest thing to a concealer without being an actual concealer. That being said, both of these do have full opacity on the lid, but they also have their own undertone. So the undertone of Sigma does tend to alter the way that the mattes are on the lid versus the Natasha Denona. I find that this one is, it's not fully neutral, but I think it's the closest to being neutral, so I don't really notice my eyeshadows looking too different on top of this one. That being said, if you want to do super colorful, bright looks, especially with pastels, then you might have a little bit of a tonal shift, especially with the Sigma primer. The Natasha Denona primer is $26. You get 4 milliliters or 0.135 fluid ounces. As for the Sigma primer, this one you are getting 0.04 ounces and it is $30. Since when is a Sigma eyeshadow primer $30? I actually went and I found when I first launched this eyeshadow primer, and I found a video from a YouTuber. She did a dedicated video on them and they were $15 when they first launched. I understand the higher pricing of Too Faced, Natasha Denona, MAC, etc. because they are higher end brands, but Sigma, $30 for an eyeshadow stick? I'm sorry, I feel like that is just too much, way too much. I've used both of these on and off for years, so it's again one of those primers that sometimes, depending on the matte shadow, it does kind of stick down a little bit because these do not fully set to like a matte, like fully matte. They do remain a little bit almost tacky without being like a shimmer primer or glitter glue. They just have a little bit of like that, like possible tug for when you start blending on it, and some mattes respond to that better than others. Overall, I think if you use these kinds of primers, you're going to get full opacity right off the bat. More silicone primers, you might have a little bit more of like a build type of experience. That being said, I did experience a little bit of the matte eyeshadow sticking down on top of the Sigma primer, but I had quite a bit of opacity on this one and also the Natasha Denona. If you go in with a lighter hand and you tap off a little bit of the excess off the brush, you can definitely build on both of these, but I think overall I had a pretty decent time with both of them. I do prefer, between just these two, I do prefer the Natasha Denona. As for the wear time, surprise surprise, these both creased quite a bit, which is very much to be expected because they are a little bit more on the creamy side. I knew this was coming. That is pretty much my general experience with these, that they do crease. So after I wear tested all 16 of these primers, I thought I would do a little bit of an experiment. Let's take the two primers that crease the most and let's set them with the loose setting powder, because this is something I've been doing for quite a while. I know that there's a lot of mixed feelings on that. I know some people are very against setting eyeshadow primers, and I totally understand. If you're doing very colorful rainbow looks, they're very intricate, you're adding just a lot of colors together, then I totally understand. If you're doing a lot of neutral looks, it's really not going to affect it that much. I also experience a little bit better blending time when I do set certain primers, especially the more silicone ones that tend to be a little bit tuggy sometimes. So the two primers that I thought really wore horribly that I wanted to experiment this on is the Pat McGrath and the Natasha Denona. I experienced a really easy blend, really easy, more of a build for sure, because you do have that layer of powder down already. So after the 12 hours, these wore so much better. I still saw a little bit more creasing with the Natasha Denona, but really not as bad as when it wasn't set. And I really feel like the Pat McGrath primer just performed so much better. It was quite a bit of a difference, and it definitely proved my theory that the setting of the lid helps. I am more likely to use some of these other eyeshadow primers that creased on me previously as long as I set them. That is an option. I definitely recommend you trying it out, especially if you have hooded oily lids. So let the ranking commence. I definitely feel pretty set on the bottom 6, and then after that I feel like they're a little bit interchangeable. As you could see, some of these kind of wore very similarly. Something else I did take into account is the pricing. So I feel like the pricing is worth it for wear time and how eyeshadows blend on top of it. So in last place is the Melt Liquid Eyeshadow and Base, really mostly because of the shade and how much it alters the eyeshadow on top of it on my skin tone personally. So it is just something I'm not going to be able to get really much use out of. I would really have to try to just kind of apply it kind of on the lid and then try to blend it up. So I think if I'm going for a neutral eyeshadow look, I would maybe reach for it because the wear time and the blending was good, but it is just at the bottom. And also I kind of have to go a little bit out of my way to buy it. So even if this was my by far most favorite eyeshadow primer of all time, I would have to go on the Moira Cosmetics website and just pay for this primer, which is $24, which I feel like is a kind of a lot, even though you're getting a lot of product, but it's like their shipping is kind of expensive. Overall, I just think it belongs in the bottom. So then the next primer is the waterproof peptide primer from Moira Cosmetics, because this one creased so much. I did not try setting this yet. That being said, I don't know if I would really reach for this because it just seems to be a little bit too unpredictable. So I think I would use this when I'm doing multiple looks and I'm not really worried about wear time. But otherwise, it's just not my favorite, not really a standout, not one that I'm like, oh yeah, I better go use that waterproof primer from Moira Cosmetics. Number 14 is the Natasha Denona eyeshadow primer, because even after setting it, it did still crease. And this is a primer I don't even use already on a daily basis. So I just know it's at the bottom, because while I love the way eyeshadows blend on it and build on it, and I think they look really nice and vibrant and like fully opaque on this, even if I was to set it, it's just not an eyeshadow primer that I would wear to the office for a 12-hour day 3 times a week. In 13th place is the Sigma eyeshadow primer. I just think it's so expensive. It does have good coverage, but I feel like I'm gonna run through this one pretty quickly. Something else I noticed is I think they changed the color of this one. I feel like it used to be, no, it's still a little bit, it's like, it's got a little bit of a tone to it, and I feel like that alters the look of my shadow. So I would only really use this one if I'm using neutral matte. Between all those things together, I just feel like I would rather pay $30 for some of these other eyeshadow primers. In 12th place is the Devinah primer, really mostly because I just find mattes to be a lot harder to blend on this. It's really finicky, plus the fact that it makes my eyelids look way more wrinkly, and also because it adds texture to my lids. The balance of all those cons versus like no creasing at all, amazing wear time. In this case, the pros don't outweigh the cons. Number 11, I'm putting the MAC primer, purely because I just don't love the blending on this one. I feel like it's very hit or miss. It's a little bit finicky. It's not my favorite. And plus the wear time, it's pretty good wear time, but not the best. I think if I set it, I think it would be a little bit better for sure, but I feel like it's a little bit expensive, and all the things together, I just prefer some of these other eyeshadow primers a little bit more. On the other hand, in 10th place is the Moira regular eyeshadow primer. I definitely think this one would be really great if I set it. I think I would have almost no creasing because it already didn't really have much creasing. I think the blending was really nice on it, so I definitely want to keep using this one. I do have a little bit more experience with some of these other eyeshadow primers compared to this one, but I do like it, and it's not expensive. I just think I would reach for some of these other eyeshadow primers over this one. In 9th place is the Urban Decay Primer Potion. I feel like this one, the Moira, the Milani, and the e.l.f., they all kind of had similar wear times essentially. So I feel like these are kind of semi-interchangeable, but I do like the blending on this. I think overall it's a little bit too expensive, so I don't think it's something I would repurchase. In 8th place is the Milani eyeshadow primer. I feel like the blending was a little bit iffy, and it is something I've been experiencing. Some different matte formulas. It is very affordable, which is awesome. It doesn't look like you're getting a lot of product, but I feel like a little bit goes a long way, so I feel like this is going to last me quite a while. I did have a little bit of creasing, but I could just set it. So overall, I do think I'm going to be reaching for this one. 6 and 7 are a little bit more interchangeable slots. I don't feel like I really love one over the other more than each other, so I would say 6 would be e.l.f., and then in 7th place would be Pat McGrath, because this is so expensive. And this one definitely will need to be set if I plan on wearing it for 12 hours. Well, this one had better wear time, but sometimes I've had pretty good wear time with Pat McGrath and a really great time with different matte eyeshadow formulas. So I do really like it. I'm gonna get my use out of it, but I don't think I would repurchase this one. The same thing goes for the e.l.f. primer, minus obviously this is much more affordable. We're in the top 5. So in 5th place is the Wet n Wild Mega Last eyeshadow primer. This one is relatively new to me compared to some of these other primers, so I do feel like I definitely need to try it out some more with different mattes, but I was very impressed with the application of mattes over this, and also with the wear time. And also it is very affordable, so I think overall this has a lot of great things going for it, so I'm looking forward to trying this one more. I definitely will have this one in my main rotation. In 4th place is the NYX Cosmetics primer, and this one really impressed me because the wearing on this was really amazing. Really great. I think the thing I'm a little iffy on is the blending. It was just a little bit harder, but in this case, the fact that I had no creasing in 12 hours definitely outweighs the fact that blending took a little bit more elbow grease. In third place, I'm putting the Ulta Beauty Matte Veil Primer. Really, the biggest thing this has going for it is the fact that it's a little bit of coverage, and I would prefer a little bit of coverage in an eyeshadow primer. This one really holds its own because of that. I do have a little bit of creasing here and there, but setting it would help with that. And I've used this one with a lot of different matte formulas. So overall, I really like this one. Again, kind of all the things together. Would I repurchase it? I think I would, because of the coverage, because I feel like that's a hole in my eyeshadow primers, especially in like my top favorite eyeshadow primers. In second place, I'm putting the About Face primer. I was very impressed with the wear time on this. The blending was good, but I do definitely want to try this one out with a lot more mattes to really get a better feel for it. But so far, it's really nice. I wish it had a little bit of coverage like the Ulta Matte Veil primer, but the wear time on this one does outweigh that. And then in first place, I'm putting my tried and true for years, and this is the Too Faced Shadow Insurance Primer. It is expensive, but I feel like there's a really good amount of product, even though technically there isn't a lot of product, but like a little bit goes a long way, if that makes sense. It doesn't have really much coverage at all, maybe just like a hint of a coverage. And as I mentioned, I do like to set this one so it lasts me 12 hours on the lids, no creasing. There are some mattes that do stick down a little bit upon application, but since I do use this one set, I have no issues with blending or application of mattes at all. So I have repurchased it many times. I feel like it's my comfort primer, so I will keep repurchasing it. Even though it is on the expensive side, I do buy it when I have a coupon for Ulta Beauty, or Too Faced is having a sale on their website, so you can get up to like 20-30% off of this one, and that's when I buy them. But if I absolutely had to buy it full price, I would flinch only a little bit. So overall, I feel like this one is just my go-to, my favorite. But I would be actually really curious to do a refilm this video minus the wear test, because that was a lot. Maybe I'll do an updated video of this at the end of the year, just kind of like an update. What are my top 5 eyeshadow primers at that time? Maybe by then I'll also have tried some other eyeshadow primers. Maybe there's some new ones coming out in the meantime. So I really hope this video was helpful. I'm very curious to hear all your thoughts on different eyeshadow primers. What are your tried and true eyeshadow primers? And if you enjoyed this video or you found it helpful, don't forget to give this video a thumbs up and share it with anyone you think might benefit from this information. And thank you so much for watching. I hope to see you next time.